going on, everybody? Michael Renee here, and this is not a makeup video. Today I have been released to finally tell my story. I've been waiting to hear what the Lord wanted to say and to even give me the proper instructions, because I do believe that in the midst of me telling my story, I'm still here, one, to protect even those that did not protect me, or protect those that, and still honor them, but still be able to tell my story and share my testimony, of course, from a healed place and from a healed version of me. And so if you would like to hear my story about my journey as a prophet and the things I had to walk through, keep watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. So my story starts as a little girl who was born and raised in church. I've been in church my entire life. From the womb on in, I was in church my entire life. And I got introduced to the prophetic, I want to say, when I was 12 years old. And that's when I learned about prophets, and something bubbled up in me. I was so intrigued. I went from being a Baptist church girl into a non-denomination, and, it was new, it was exciting, but I never thought myself to be a prophet. Like, I had very low self-esteem growing up. And so when I would see prophets, I would see them confident, prestige, and elegant. And I didn't see myself as that. So I didn't see myself as that. I could say that. But I know that growing up, although I was born and raised in church, I didn't build my own relationship with God until I was in my 20s. At this point, I had moved away from my parents. I moved out of my parents' house, moved back to my hometown. And I had to find God on my own. I had to learn God for myself. Now, that does not mean that I did not start hearing God's voice until I was in my 20s. I heard God's voice at a very young age, and I knew it was God type of situation, but there was still always a disconnect. I did not put two and two together until I got older, and the Lord began to deal with me. And he was like, hey, remember when you were 5? Remember when you were 3? Remember when you were 2? I remember all the way back when I was 2. He was like, remember this and remember that. Remember when you were in elementary school. Now, there were times and moments that I know I heard God's voice very clearly, but I didn't think anybody believed me. And so, unfortunately, most people who were born and raised in church, especially we can get back to the millennials and, back baby boomers and all of that, a lot of people did not learn how to build a relationship with God, or even how to hear God's voice. I always was taught how to pray, worship, praise, but I never knew what it meant to build my own relationship with God until I got older. And so as I got older, God began to deal with me about the call of the prophet. And I always knew that I was different. I knew I was different. I knew I was set apart, but I did not quite, the prophet never came to mind. I knew I had a love for the prophetic when it was introduced to me, and when I learned that I too can prophesy, but I just didn't know that being a prophet was for me. I didn't know that until 2016. I started taking more prophetic classes, because I started taking prophetic classes in 2014, and although it was an introduction for me, but in 2016, I was full blown, like, as it came to the prophetic. I started to learn more about prophecy. I started to have a deeper hunger for prophecy, wanting to learn more, started reading more books, started taking more classes. But let me kind of back up a little bit. So in 2015, the Lord moved me south, and I started going. He sent me to a particular church, and so this is the church where I dealt with the trauma. And so I want to make it clear right here. This is not a video to bash anybody. This is not a video to expose anybody or anything to that nature. I am one who God has actually dealt with me when it comes down to exposure for personal reasons. The Lord made it very clear. He was like, exposure shows the heart of said person, and we're not here to expose anybody. I'm here to bring awareness. I'm here to help other prophets who have been stuck, in their caves. Their mouths have been shut. I've been there. Who are broken and who are on the verge of walking away from God. I've been there, and I really want to help. And so this is what this video is about. This is my healing journey. And of course, I'm going to add in, this bits and pieces of what I've walked through, but this is not an exposure video. And so God sent me to the particular church. It was a very popular church in the city I lived in. And also it was we ended up being under a entity, very well-known entity. It was very popular for a while, but of course, all of those things will remain nameless. And I remember when God sent me to the church, I was growing, and I was growing quick. And I didn't realize it until, honestly, these past few years when God began to deal with me about like the pain and everything that I walked through, because I had to go back. I had to go back to where things kind of changed, even with my relationship with God. And so God was moving me quickly. Like there were instances, my gifts were growing a lot faster than I realized at the moment. I was spending God was putting a lot on my plate, but it wasn't overwhelming. It wasn't anything that would make me tired or anything that would make me feel overwhelmed. He was doing it because he could trust me. And I did not see it at that time. I thought that God was doing that to everybody. And God really set me apart. And so when God sent me to this particular church, I was under the impression that God was going to send me to a prophetic house, a very strong prophetic house. And that was not the case. God actually sent me to my old church and under my old leader on assignment. And I remember him speaking to me about being on assignment, but I knew I was on assignment, but I didn't quite... I'm still a baby prophet, like I just learned. Matter of fact, at that point, I didn't know I was a prophet right away. I just knew that I was an intercessor. I knew that God called me to pray, and that's what I did. I loved prayer. Whatever God would tell me to pray about certain things, I prayed. I learned about prayer, but I didn't put two and two together right away, on top of the fact that I was still dealing with a lot of low self-esteem. There was still a lot of confidence that God had to, pull out of me and just build up in me. And so, and honestly, I still struggled with hearing. I heard God's voice, and I never questioned the fact that I heard from God, but there were moments that I would question what I would hear, if that makes any sense. And so I struggled with that, and that kind of leads me into this next part of my story. And I just want to say this. Sometimes I would envy those who, and not in no deep like jealousy type of thing, but sometimes I would envy those who are new believers, like they were not born and raised in church, because I always felt as if, and still feel this way a little bit, that they have an advantage that people who were born and raised in church does not. For me, building my relationship with God under my parents was completely different than me building my through my parents, was completely different than building my relationship with God without my parents. Because although I had the foundation set, there was still a lot that I had to unlearn. And even when I dealt with like my spiritual abuse, and again, this is to cover my parents as well. Even when I walked through the spiritual abuse, even at my church, at my old church, the Lord was like, it never started in the church, Michael. A lot of the reason why you walked through what you walked through was also because it was learned behavior that your parents learned. And, this is generational, like when it comes down to spiritual abuse. And it blew my mind. And so I had to learn God's voice for myself. I had to build my relationship with God, without my parents. And that was different, because there was so much that I had to unlearn. And I believe that even what I had to walk through being at my old church and being under my old leader, I do believe that that played a big part in it. And I'm grateful. It was hard. Like I remember saying this, and I could not believe it came out of my mouth. I was like, man, I'm actually kind of glad that I walked through what I walked through, because I learned so much, but it was still painful. And so, 2016, you know, I got introduced to this particular young prophet actually in the city that I lived in, powerful man of God. And that's where my journey started. It started in 2014, but like the ball got rolling in 2016. And so with taking those classes and even just building my relationship with God, I didn't realize like I was growing. Like I said, I was growing very, very quickly. And I started to become confident in what I was hearing God say to me. And I started I started to become confident in the fact that like, wow, you really do hear from God, Michael, because confirmation be everywhere. Learning that I was a prophet, it was almost like a seal, like almost kind of like, this is what you've been missing your entire life. And I was like, it was like, that's why I had to walk through this. That's why I had to walk through that. That's why I went through that season in my life. And it sealed everything. And I remember being so hungry, like, oh, I'm a prophet. I want to help now. And I wish somebody was there to tell me, slow your roll, sis. Back it on up like a U-Haul truck, you know, like, cause your heart is in the right place, but you have to use wisdom, right? And so I didn't have anybody to tell me that. I was ready to help. I was giving words out of timing. I had to learn timing. I was just prophesying. And for the most part, like, you know, God allowed me to roam free to an extent with that. But I had to learn a lot, like, timing. And one of the biggest things I had to learn was, yeah, you heard from God and other people heard from God, but they don't want you to know that you heard from God. And there's a thing called disobedience that you have to kind of walk through. Not your obedience, but other people's, you know, disobedience. And sometimes they're not going to want to hear. Sometimes they're not going to want to be obedient to the voice of the Lord. And sometimes, sis, you get the backlash of that. So I'm going too quick. So let me back it up a little bit. So I remember, and I can share this part because I want to be very, like I said, I want to be sensitive to the Holy Spirit as I'm telling this story. I remember God began to deal with me about my leader, powerful man of God. And the Lord told me, and at that point, I didn't know what an apostle was. The Lord told me that, you know, he was going to be, you know, there was going to be churches that were going to pop up in cities that a lot of people wouldn't think to go to. And I remember hearing this one particular, I heard Idaho, as crazy as that sounds. I said, Idaho? Who goes to Idaho? And the Lord was like, my point. And I kid you not, it was either the next day or the next week, because it was Saturday. We were having prophetic classes when I was under the young prophet. And I remember I think it was the next day, y'all. Like, I want to say it was the very next day. We ended up getting there was an announcement at the church. And the announcement was that we were partnering or coming under the entity of a church in another city that was growing very quickly. And I remember sitting there listening to the leader, my old pastor at that time. And I remember them talking about us being connected. Like, we had heard about them, but I did not think that a connection was going to come from that. And we were still unclear of the details, honestly. But he recorded a video to let us know about the merger. And I remember hearing the Holy Spirit say, this is not my will. I kept hearing him say that. This is not my will. This is not my will. And I was like, this was the first time that I had experienced hearing the voice of the Lord, but there being resistance on the other end. And I remember this statement stuck with me. And this was the beginning of the journey of healing that I had to walk through, spiritual abuse that I had to walk through or heal from, and just almost kind of like a downhill journey from there. And I'm going to get to it. So I remember hearing God say that that was not his will. And I remember my old leader saying, and it's funny because the entire church actually felt the same way. You hear the conversations about it later on, and the church felt the same. And I remember my old leader said, if you do not agree with this merger, then you are a witch. And it was in that moment where I began to become confident with hearing the voice of the Lord. It was in that moment where I started to no longer be confident anymore. I began to question what I heard, because not realizing that, number one, that was manipulation. Two, there was a spirit of witchcraft at play. And my pastor at the time, I don't think he knew it. And I remember saying to myself, well, I don't want to be a witch. I need to comply. Well, maybe it's me. Maybe it's me, God. Maybe I'm wrong. And that's where the confusion started. I didn't even realize it now that I'm saying it. That's where confusion came in, chaos came in, double-mindedness came in. And that really messed with me. Now that I think about it, that really messed with my mind, because all I kept thinking, I was like, I don't want to be a witch. I don't want to be out of order. And that was always like growing up. And that's almost like the response. Now, granted, that should be everybody's heart, but that little girl came up because of, growing up in the household of, you got to say what I say and you got to do what I say, and you don't need in the constant whoopings, and I'm telling my story, but the constant getting in trouble. But I heard God, but because in that moment I didn't know that was a spirit of witchcraft at play, it really put me in a very bad space. And that's where the questioning began. Like, I started to question everything. And a prophet that is struggling with hearing from the Lord, or struggling with believing what it is that they hear, is a recipe for a disaster. And I started to conform to a demonic plan. And I didn't realize it at that time, because at this point, my senses began to dull. There were things that God was revealing to me that I began to question. There were things that God was showing me, like I would be like, I don't want to say too much, but I would be like, is that? And I'm like, nah, that can't be it. That can't be it. So my senses begin to dull. It's not that I didn't see what I saw. I saw what I saw, but I would dismiss it because I needed to comply. I wanted to comply. I did not want to be out of order, but there was the prophet in me, or even the Holy Spirit, that was like, wouldn't let me be settled. And so it would not settle. It wouldn't allow me to settle with the decision that I made. But that, you can only imagine the fighting, the internal warfare that I had to walk through, because when we got connected to that particular entity, things got worse. It was literally everything went downhill from there. It was a downhill slope. Just think of think of a steep mountain, and you have this snowball, and like, it was a snowball effect. It got worse and it got bigger fast. It was bad. And I believe that, and so let me get back. So I started to conform. As prophets, we know that we've been set apart. What does that look like? When everybody else is saying yes, God is saying no, and you have to stand on the side that God is saying. You have to stand on the God's side, or the side that God is saying, hey, no, that's not right. And you can't even be in the middle. And I think I battled with that, to where like everybody else was saying yes, I was on the side that was saying no. But as soon as I was manipulated, or as soon as spiritual abuse came into effect, I wouldn't be on the yes side. But then again, you might as well be, because even with you and being in the middle, either you're gonna be hot or you're gonna be cold. You cannot be lukewarm, because the Bible says that God is gonna spit you out. But I was in the middle. I knew what I saw was wrong. Like, there was a lot of open doors to sin. There was a lot of witchcraft, and not even to make matters worse, we lived in a city where witchcraft was high. It was high ranking. Like, I remember, I had left the church at this point, but I remember in 2022, the Lord told me to pour oil on my porch and to pray over my house on the outside. I said, God, what's going on? And he said, Michael, a portal's been opened up. There's a lot of, like, he was like, there's a lot of high ranking witches in this city. Had no clue, like been living here for a good portion of my life and had no clue that it was that bad. And so, yeah, so time just got worse. And as things got worse, my senses began to dull. But thanks be to God, they weren't that dull because I still saw and I still would speak what God told me to speak, but my confidence was shot. Like a lot, and it's funny because a lot of people were jealous of me because of my confidence, and little did they know it was a tug and pull, and I felt like a slave. And I speak a lot about, and I actually spoke about it in my last video, like just kind of warning pastors and them to be warning pastors and wanting pastors to be more open, like, hey, you can't pull on your prophet or you can't pull on their gifts, but yet not place them, but yet not cover them, but yet when things go bad, now you're neglecting them, and now you're still calling on the gifts, but their soul is being neglected. And I just remember, I remember just going through a time where, man, I was so immature and didn't even realize, like, didn't even see it. Like, I had this idea of because this is what was conformed, this is what was told to me. I had this idea of what a prophet should be, and not even realizing that, sis, you were under spiritual abuse. Like, it was even so much so to where I believe that there's order, because church can't run without order, life can't run without order. But it was so much so to where God had to, I had to unlearn a lot. Like, God was like, that's not Holy Spirit. That's not what that was supposed to be. He said that was witchcraft. That was to keep you under control and to keep your mouth shut. But one thing that God, even going back of it, there was like this bubbling, which is like a nabi. That's the word nabi, that means to bubble up. There was a bubbling up inside of me that I could not stay quiet, even in the midst of being completely. And when I say this, my senses weren't completely dulled, because I could still see, but it was the close things that were around me that I ended up dismissing the most. And God was like, no, I need you to see this. And so it was almost as if Satan couldn't keep my mouth shut. Like, I still saw, and God snatched me out so quickly. But when he snatched me out, it was the most pain that I had ever experienced. Like I said, being under, because the entity that we ended up being connected to, we had no idea the amount of sin and witchcraft, and it was bad. Like, it was so bad. I believe that they could be powerful people, but when you're under sin and you're not repentant, and this is when we get into the conversation of the reprobate mind, and that ended up flowing into our leader. And we were already, let me explain. When you as a person, you're not repentant, God puts you over into a reprobate mind, and he's waiting for you to come back. But in the midst of you being under a reprobate mind, you start to connect to people that God never called you to connect to. And that's exactly what ended up happening. So not only was I under, spiritual abuse, but there was a lot of false doctrine that we consumed, and I had to unlearn a lot of stuff. Like, I just remember, this, and now that I think about it, like, everything happened so quickly, because all of this happened in 2016. And I want to say it was 2018 where I started to, like, still be in the house. And mind you, God hadn't released me yet. So I want to be clear. So some of you are probably like, why didn't you leave? Because God didn't release me. And I remember in 2018, I was like, I'm not getting fed. Like, I started to become hungry. And that's exactly how I felt when I first got rebaptized in 2014. The church that I went to, my old church, back in my hometown, I loved that church. worship. I learned how to worship. I learned about my gifts of tongues. I received my gift of tongues in that church, but the word wasn't there. And I was hungry. And that's exactly how I felt in 2018. I'm just like, God, I'm not getting fed. And so one of the things that I've learned is like, you can't just expect the pastor to just feed you on Sunday and on Wednesday or whenever you have Bible study. I was listening to I had to listen to different podcasts, different sermons and stuff like that. But my discernment was low key off because the other people that I would be listening to, and it wasn't all off. Like the apostle that we sat under, I would listen to a lot of their teachings, and we'll get into that in a minute. God had to pull me from that. It was one Sunday I was like, oh no. It was something that was said. I said, excuse me, and the Lord was like, cut it off. Don't go back and listen to them. And so anywho, and so it was in 2018 where I started to like not be fed. And, there were things that I saw, like I said, things got worse in that house and I was seeing it happen. But in the midst of me seeing, I saw the abuse that other prophets, other anointed vessels that were sent to that house, I saw what they had to walk through. And after a while, the true prophets that God sent started leaving. Some of which I believe left outside of their timing. Others, it was probably time for them, but God didn't release me to leave. He didn't release me. I feel like I have to tell this part, so let me go back. Another reason why I questioned a lot of what I heard God say, and this is where the witchcraft kind of, came in. But like I said, I want to be clear, when you're under sin, you can't see, you can't hear, literally. And so God would speak to me about the health of the church. He would speak to me about where the church was headed. God was speaking to me about exposure and scandal and all of those things. And what's crazy is, even though he was still speaking to me about those things, I was still like, my senses were still kind of dull to where I could not see in front of me. It's crazy how that works. And God would speak to me about this like Saturday night. And then Sunday morning, my old pastor would get on the stage, and it was a plan of the enemy, and would completely speak against what God just got finished speaking to me about, almost to the effect of, they would say things like, every word that you got it shouldn't be a bad word. If it's a bad word, then that's something within you. Or when God would show me things about certain people, the old leader would say things like, only petty people would say, like, there's something about you that I just can't put my finger on. You're just jealous. Y'all, I got to a point where I started to think that I was one of the biggest haters in the world. And I know I'm not a hater. I check myself. And it happened like clockwork, like consistently happened like clockwork. And I was just like, every single time God will begin to speak to me and mind you, I wouldn't be having conversations or anything all the time, because I had to learn how to, like, people that I thought were my friends, like I would, some of them, and not all the time I would share, but like something that God would say, and I learned really quickly that some of them was running back or they would try to make it seem as if God gave the words to them and he didn't, and they would add their own flair to it. But in most cases, I didn't say anything. And so I thought I was losing my mind. Like, it happened like clockwork. And so that's what had me in this tangle, because I'm like, but God, I'm spending time with the Lord. I'm reading my word. I'm sitting with God every morning. It was like clockwork for me. I would get up at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning and spend like 2 or 3 hours, about 2 or 3 hours in prayer. And then I would go back to sleep and be refreshed, wake up, got to go to work. And so I was like, I thought I was losing my mind. On top of the fact that I'm still being pulled, on top of the fact that people are still pulling on me to give words. The leaders are still pulling on me to give words. Michael, what is the Lord saying? But as soon as I begin to call things out, or as soon as I begin to speak and say, this is what God is saying. And I talked about this in my last video, where a lot of leaders, instead of you taking heed to what the Lord is saying, because that spirit that is operating in that house that has legal right, it's offended now. Or it brings forth a spirit of offense, because now you're messing with what I have going, with what I got going on in the house. And so now I'm gonna come get you. And what that does, it leaves prophets open to be attacked. It leaves prophets open to vulnerable to the attacks. But the attacks, here's the thing, the attacks, what makes it matters worse, because we're dealing with a spiritual realm. The attacks are not coming from a spirit, not just like a spiritual entity that we can see. It's coming from the leadership. It's coming from pastors. It's coming from the people around you. And so I had so many darts coming against me. And I knew there were times, I was just telling a friend of mine, I said, there were times that I knew I was uncovered. Like, I knew there would be moments that I would question. I'm like, yo, are you even covering me? Like, I had to even ask that question. But there was a lot of jealousy, a lot of, because God called, it was weird. Like, even though there was a internal battle, I was still hearing from God, and I was still being obedient and speaking. But when narcissism comes from the pulpit, and this is what was going on in the pulpit. And so I remember, if I'm gonna tell a story, I gotta tell everything. In 2018 was when my whole world changed. Summer 2018 was when my whole world changed. I started drinking. I started smoking. It was horrible, because I was trying to numb what was going on around me. And it's crazy, because I remember a prophet prophesied over me back in 2022, and he said, in 2018 your whole world, man, I fell to the ground, because it was in 2018 that's where everything started. There was so much demonic activity, and even like, I want to say, for the past three and a half years, God has even been exposing and even bringing forth clarity and revelation of what happened even back then. And so the drinking wasn't to the point of getting drunk, but thank God for godly friends, because I opened up to a friend of mine, and I was like, yo, I've been drinking a lot. And she was like, yeah, like, we was going out to eat like it was nobody's business. She was like, yeah, I noticed, like, every time we go out to eat, and we went out to eat a lot, you always had to have you a drink. And I started to see myself go down this spiral. And I believe it was in that moment, I didn't see it at that time, that God wanted to snatch me out. Like I said, we were under an apostle or church entity that was ungodly. On top of the fact that our church that's why God sent me there in the first place. I was on assignment, and it just got worse once we got connected to that entity. So there was a lot that was going on. I was questioning myself. I started to become double-minded in what I was hearing God say, but still speaking the word of the Lord. It was weird. And so it was 2019. This is where I wanted to get to. 2019 was when everything changed. Everything changed, because God is still dealing with me, and I'm still speaking the word of the Lord. But this is what I had to learn during that time. I started to, because God told me to, but I didn't understand legal rights. And so now I've already been poking at the bear, but I spoke about something that had a legal right in my church. Not only did it have a legal right, but one of the leaders during that time actually ended up going to pledge. Like, nobody knew. And I spoke against, it happened already speaking against it, but baby, I poked this bear, and I guess it was like, you poke me, I'm gonna get you. And that was when I spoke against That's when I started speaking against the fraternities, the sororities, and stuff like that. And that's when my whole world changed. Like, I was already poking the bear. Like I said, I was already, because I was doing what God told me to do. And it was getting to a point to where I believe that God was opening up my eyes, and I started almost kind of like you're awaking a sleeping giant. And again, I didn't know much about legal rights, and I also didn't know that the pastor, one of the pastors at the time, was actually left to go pledge. And baby, when I tell you that thing came for my jugular, it was almost like hook, line, and sinker. I was no longer safe at that house. Why God didn't let me leave, but I'm gonna get to that in a second. During that time, I have no idea. And what's crazy is I had people tell me, like, you need to go, but God was like, stay put. I should have now. This is what I should have done. And I wish that, I know now. I do believe that, number one, I should have used wisdom, because although God was speaking to me about it, I didn't understand legal rights. That's one. Two, I do believe that I should have taken a sabbatical. I do believe that I should have left, but because imagine being at a church where your leader and even the apostle over that church is basically saying, like, you'll never find a church like this. You'll never find a church like this. And the city that I lived in, I knew I wasn't going to find a church, but I had already been sucked in. Mind you, I didn't want to go there in the first place. Like, God sent me to that church. I was hoping God was going to send me somewhere else, but I had got sucked in completely. And I think because I got sucked in the way that I did, the Lord had to snatch me out. And I remember, I never forget it, my brother prophesied over me, and he didn't realize that's what he was doing. He was like, you got too comfortable. He said, you got too familiar. You've been set apart. God had to snatch you out. Because you kept questioning what you were hearing God say, and you were dismissing things and letting things slide under your nose while still speaking and doing what God was telling you to do, but you're not being effective. You're still prophesying and giving the word of the Lord, but the little stuff that's around you, you're dismissing it because of what was going on in the pulpit. It tore me up. I was like, man. And so 2019, there was a reason why God told me not to wear makeup. In 2019, I didn't know if I was coming or going. Not even, and I have to kind of give myself some grace too, because I remember this lady said to me, she said, she actually warned her niece, because her niece started going to the church, and she actually warned her niece. She said, be careful, because there's a lot of mental oppression and mental warfare that's under that particular pastor. And if you're not careful, and I'm learning this now even as a leader, if you're not careful, you can end up dealing with the same mental oppression and warfare. And so I sat myself down from everything. I was on a prayer team. I sat myself down because I no longer felt safe. I did not trust any of the pastors. I did not trust any of the leaders. I ended up going to a meeting that God told me not to go to, and it was an ambush from hell. I was lied on, and the entire time God was telling me, like, none of what they're saying is true. None of what they're saying is true. And it wasn't until about 2 years later that God brought clarity to what he was saying to me in that meeting. It was after that meeting that I didn't walk out of there the same. I thank God that God healed me from that space, because even telling the story, I have to remember everything because God really dealt with me. But it was after that meeting, and I set the meeting up because you called me a house prophet, but I'm not placed, and everything that I do is wrong. And instead of you coming to me and talking to me about things, or even asking me, because at this point, y'all, I was calling things out left and right. And of course that was making the devil mad. And of course, even those that were the one doing the sin, it was almost as if they had the leader's ear. But if you're under sin, you can't see anything different. So I was being lied on. My name was being dragged in the mud, and the Holy Spirit even revealed to me later on that it was almost kind of like a throwing the stones and hiding your hands type situation, where the Lord was like, hey, you were so offended, you couldn't even see that it was your pastor that was doing all of the stuff behind the scenes. And I was broken. Like I didn't prophesy for months. I didn't trust what I heard. I didn't trust what was coming out of my mouth, even though I heard from God. I heard him, and everything that I said was accurate. That's why I always say, give it time. God will always confirm his word. And I bless God with that. But I kept my mouth shut. I didn't know if I was coming or going. And I remember this day like it was yesterday. I still felt like I had to show up. Imagine where the entire, well, from what it looked like, the entire this one was the entire leadership team. Mind you, there's few of them that you've prophesied over that was accurate. You've prayed over them and everything. But because you spoke against and came against this one thing, on top of the jealousy that you don't see, on top of the jealousy, and on top of the witchcraft that you don't see. And this is why I always tell people, do your research, because even the witchcraft was so bad. The part of town that we ended up moving to, and even the church building that we were at, had history that went so far back. I remember God giving me a vision, and I saw where there were bodies that were buried underneath the concrete. And it's crazy because if you go to that church now, the concrete is like the pavement is screwed up. Like it's completely unleveled, cracks everywhere. You would have thought that an earthquake came and just completely destroyed it. And there was history there. The Lord told me that witches built that church. Witches built the church, and you can feel it when you walk in. You can feel it on the street. That's how strong the stronghold is there. And so yeah, there was a lot of things at play, and you still showed up. And I remember hearing the Lord say, give your life back to me. But I took it as going during the 3 calls. And y'all, I remember going up to the front, and, people walking up. I did have, still had people there that I don't think they knew the depth of what was going on with me. But I remember leaving the church. I remember getting in my car. And I can't even tell you how I got home. I don't remember how I got home. The only thing I could remember during that time was, that's why God told me not to wear no makeup. I didn't think I was going to cry because I'm not a crier. I remember stopping by Wendy's to get me something to eat. And I'm a superhero nerd, like a geek when it comes down to that. I don't watch it anymore, but Marvel and, DC comics, like I used to love that. And I remember thinking about Gotham Asylum, or it wasn't Gotham, Arkham Asylum. And I remember asking myself, like, I wonder if the city that I lived in, I wonder if they have a mental institution, because I feel like I have to check myself in. I remember getting my food. I don't remember getting to the house, but I remember sitting in my car crying for hours. Because at that moment, I thought I lost my mind. I thought I had lost my mind. And, but I still showed up because I felt like I had to. But that's where the spiritual abuse and the manipulation comes in. Because I was under such manipulation and didn't even realize it. But God did his big one when he allowed COVID. I'm so sorry if you lost loved ones from COVID, but COVID was an answered prayer for me. When COVID came around, before COVID came around, I focused on my business. I had a salon, and I knew I wanted to make my salon. I wanted to travel. I wanted to be known as the natural hairstylist of, the world, I guess. And I put my all in my business. But it's so crazy because during that year, 2019 was the year that I was the most broken, but it was the year that my business made the most money. I made almost $65,000 that year. My business made the most money that year. Crazy, right? And so 2020 hits, and things were bad. Like 2020 hit and things were bad. And mind you, I'm coming from, because I'm thinking about everything now. Mind you, I was given the word of the Lord for the New Year's service. And it's so crazy. Like I just deleted it because I needed storage and space in my phone. But everything I gave, every word that I've given in that house came to pass. Even the word that day, even the word that God gave me, and not even realizing that was a word of warning. Like I was going uncovered. I was dealing with leaders and pastors that neglected me as a person, but pulled on my gift as often as they could. I remember, I got to tell this part of the story, and then I'm gonna go into like my healing process of where it started. I remember giving my pastor a word at the time, and it was the word of the Lord. I heard him. And that man got up on that stage. I can laugh. I'm laughing at it now, but I was so mad. I remember that man got up on that stage and said out of his mouth that basically in so many words, that was not the word of the Lord, and that I need to use with. He didn't say my name specifically, but I'm gonna get to that point. He said out of his mouth that was not the word of the Lord, and he looked at me and said that I needed to use wisdom, and I had needed to understand timing with giving the word. But all I kept thinking to myself, if it was a timing thing, I would have given you the word months ago when God gave it to me the first time, over a year ago. And he looked me dead in my face, and it was during revival. It was during, it was supposed to be a revival, but it was really the church. They called it revival, but it was the church building fund event. And I remember leaving the church, and I had to repent. Well, that church was a demonic place anyway, but still I had to repent. Child, I did not leave that church good enough. I called my mama. I lost it. She just sat and listened. I was livid. I had to call her back after I had calmed down. I said, Mommy, I am so sorry. She said, girl, that's all right, because she knew what it was. She knew him and she understood. So come back for part 2 because I feel like this is going on for a long time. So come back for part 2 of my story.